The Executor is probably the coolest and edgiest Nightfarer in the game, so naturally, he's going to be the most popular one, so we're going to talk about him first. But for today, I am going to break down all of his abilities, his scalings, good weapon and relic pairings, and just rate him based on how well he performs in solo and in multiplayer. I'm going to start off first with his scalings. This man basically has no flaws, decent health and stamina, and an S scaling in both dexterity and arcane. His FP is pretty low, but for most builds with the Executor, you won't even need it, due to there being no catalyst that scales best off arcane, yes, even the Dragon Communion Seal, and because obviously he pairs very well with status effects. Now, status effects work slightly differently in this game compared to Elden Ring. They still all do percentage damage, but in Elden Ring, only a handful of status effects actually scale off a stat. Effects like Scarlet Rot and Frost don't scale off anything, but in this game, they do. They scale off arcane. So if you find a Dark Moon Greatsword or a Scorpion Stinger, you'll be able to proc the status effect faster with the Executor than with anyone else. But it's not that big of a difference, and yes, you don't need the weapon to have an arcane scaling to benefit off getting more status buildup like you have to in Elden Ring. However, the real big differences that arcane scaling gives you is when you find a bleed or poison infused weapon. Being that the weapon you start off with doesn't actually get an arcane scaling, even though you're benefiting off more status buildup, you're actually not benefiting off any more damage. But if you find a poison or blood infused weapon, or find a relic that lets your starting weapon become infused with those two, then it's not only going to give you more status buildup, but also more damage. So if you do notice any points of interest on the map that have poison or bleed icons, I would actually attack those first in hopes that you do find a poison or bleed infused weapon, specifically a dexterity based one. Now, one thing you may have noticed is that the katana moveset is different for the Executor. Compared to the regular katana moveset, it's pretty much the same in terms of speeds, both one-handed and two-handed. That means the one-handed version is going to be faster, so I would gravitate towards using that instead, because it does mean quicker status effects, and honestly does higher DPS because the strength bonus doesn't really do much for a katana. However, the two-handed running attacks do cover like insane range and incorporate this like kick in the middle of it, which is pretty cool. But this lunge that it does have actually extends to the rest of the moveset, especially those one-handed heavy attacks. And the two-handed heavy is actually a nice double hit that has some pokes, which is nice. The critical attack animation is also pretty long, which is annoying for solo play, but in multiplayer it's actually pretty good because enemies are vulnerable throughout the entire critical attack animation. And in terms of the power sensing combos, that is the exact same as they always are, which honestly I don't really like for the katanas. I would just much rather have these one-handed or two-handed. Okay, now to talk about the abilities, starting off with the passive effect Tenacity. This passive gives you a damage boost when you recover from a status effect. So for statuses like Bleed or Madness, it's instant, but for Frost and Poison, you do have to wait out the status effect, and then you will end up getting the damage buff, which is 20% for 20 seconds, which is identical to the Exaltation Talisman in Elden Ring, but the obvious difference is that you only benefit when you get hit with a status effect yourself and not the enemy. But this passive effect can actually stack. Every time you recover from a status, it just adds another 20% damage buff. However, every buff has its own timer, so it's not like you can keep resetting it over and over and constantly stack up the buffs. Now, obviously, this sounds very niche and mid, and that's because it is. Not many enemies have status effects at all. You'll literally have entire runs where you don't get procced by a status effect a single time. However, there are going to be ways to where you can proc status effects on yourself. You can throw like a Fetid Pot on the ground to proc poison. There is a relic in this game that lets you build up madness to yourself after using a certain gesture, and it does give you a bunch of FP regen. So maybe this could pair very nicely with like a skill spamming build with like the Moonveil Katana or Rivers of Blood. Now, is it worth like draining a bit of your health in like 5 whole seconds using a gesture just to be able to gain this buff? Probably not. But the obvious pairing with this passive effect would have to be Seppuku. Now, Nightreign is now on the current patch of Elden Ring for weapons and skills, so it's not going to be the broken Seppuku it once was, but with a high arcane build, it definitely can put in work. You get a nice flat damage buff, which you benefit a lot more in this game due to just damage numbers being lower in general. It does give you more bleed, and it inherently makes your weapon blood infused. Now, the obvious problem is that the game is randomized, and the chances of you actually finding Seppuku is basically next to 0. However, there are relics that you can get that let you change your starting weapon skill and have one spawn in with Seppuku. And a blood-infused Executioner's Katana with Seppuku and Bleed procced will do like twice as much damage. However, it feels like I'm saying however a lot, but yeah, however, your starting weapon has a white rarity. Any blue or purple katana is going to outdamage this even with Seppuku. Now you can just upgrade it to a blue rarity, and it still is going to get you some more bleed, so it is viable, but it's only going to be good and on par with some of these other weapons, assuming you have seppuku used, which doesn't really last that long, and more importantly, it drains your health. And in this game, healing is like the most important thing. You don't have much health, especially early on in the game, and you don't have many flasks. Seppuku is going to drain like half your health at lower levels, and also just take up a lot of your time. Like, this is not Elden Ring. You don't have the luxury to buff 1,000 times before a boss fight. So yeah, basically I just like yapped about this one passive effect for a whole minute, just to say that it's pretty mid. Okay, now for the character skill, Cursed Sword. The deflecting skill for the Executor. This is actually a stance that brings out a completely different katana that you can switch in and out of, so there is no cooldown. And in this stance, you gain the ability to deflect attacks by clicking the block button at around the same time you're about to get hit. Now, the deflect timing is super forgiving. You can click the block button like a whole second before the attack actually lands, and it will result in a deflect. But that's only for the first time. You can't like spam block like you can in Executor or Elden Ring and expect it to work, because it's not. You definitely have to know a boss's movesets and time it correctly. Now, there are 5 benefits that deflecting has. 1, you don't take any elemental damage. In terms of physical damage, every weapon does get 100% physical block anyway. If you didn't know that, now you do. It also does consume a lot less stamina than blocking, basically next to none. It also does do some stance damage, which from my estimate is about 10 stance damage, which is like roughly 2 katana light attacks worth. Also, after roughly 4 deflects, your weapon gets this cool golden buff that lets you do this amazing dashing skill attack by clicking L2. It does get lots of hyper armor throughout the animation, and it can do just as much damage as a Moonveil skill while not consuming any FP, and that's a purple rarity weapon. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't go as far as the Moonveil, nor do anywhere near as much stance damage. For some reason, this attack does just as much stance damage as a light attack compared to the Moonveil skill, which does about 30 stance damage, which is comparable to a charged heavy. I think this whole golden buff is probably a bit bugged though, as I will talk about in a bit, but the best part about deflecting outside of the low stamina cost is that they count as blocks. Therefore, you can pair these alongside all the many blocking-based buffs in the game, like damage negation on blocks, health regen, stamina boosting, and best of all yet, you can guard counter directly after a deflect, which guard counters are some of the most powerful attacks in the game due to them being very quick, outputting high stance damage, and good stagger. Now, katana guard counters aren't the best out there because they don't really output the highest stance damage nor have any hyper armor, and no, deflecting before a guard counter doesn't make it do any more damage than blocking before a guard counter. But the deflecting guard counter playstyle, specifically against those smaller enemies like knights, which you'll fight many of those throughout the game, is just incredible. Like, it definitely cheeses a lot of these enemies, and there also are buffs to actually help enhance your guard counters that you'll find along the way. Also, in this stance, you do gain the normal Executor katana moveset, but one, you can't really like do any running attacks, and also it consumes like half the stamina cost, which is just insane because a lot of the weapons in this game, pretty much all of them, consume a lot of stamina. So this is actually really good. Unfortunately, when you are in this stance, you're not allowed to sprint or run, but it can be a positive as well because there are many buffs in this game that give you AoEs when walking, like a Founding Rain of Stars buff, a Frenzied Flame AoE, and probably one of the best ones that I found were these Holy Wraiths. Hopefully I still have gameplay for it because it does put in a lot of work, but it like blocks your entire screen and you're going to need that to actually deflect attacks. Now, unfortunately, that's basically all the positives I can say about it, because yeah, there are going to be some downsides. Obviously, deflecting in this game was never going to be as good as it was in Executor or even Elden Ring, because for one, in a multiplayer game, the bosses don't tend to focus on just one person, and they also tend to be larger as well to compensate for these 3 players. And larger bosses tend to attack a lot slower and actually knock you further away so you can't punish them, which is kind of what makes deflecting so good in Executor. It does damage and enemies attack quickly. You can get off like 5 deflects in a few seconds, but in this game, you might get like 5 deflects every 20 seconds, and it only does stance damage. But I think the most disappointing thing about this skill is that the katana you use doesn't even get bleed. And as I've mentioned, this guy is the status effect character. Executor is for the status effects. He gets an S scaling and arcane. And worst of all yet, this katana just does less damage than the white rarity katana you start off with. And that one gets bleed and a good skill like Unsheath. It does eventually outdamage that katana at like level 5 or 6, but at that point you can just pick up any blue or purple rarity weapon, it'll do like 50% more damage. And you might think, okay, what about that golden buff that you get? How much more damage is that boosted by? 0. None. It only lets you use the skill and then it goes away. which honestly that might be a bug. I feel like it should have been giving a damage boost and actually do more stance damage and a light attack. So hopefully that does get fixed if it is a bug. Thankfully, you actually can store this buff when switching out of the stance though. But speaking of stance damage, the weapon itself just does less stance damage compared to a normal katana for some reason, and I don't really know why. Like, the entire point of this game is to kill things quickly, and every time that I use the skill, it just takes me so much longer to kill them compared to if I was just using a normal weapon. Like, the skill is fun, the deflect is great utility, it synergizes well with guard counters, it can be okay against those end of day bosses that cannot be procced with bleed, or as I mentioned, against those enemies like knights. There are also some relics out there that can help boost the skill, which I will cover in a bit, but the katana, for one, needs to get bleed. 2, needs a damage boost at higher levels to make it at least be on par with blue rarity weapons, and please just fix that golden buff to where you actually do get a damage boost as well. So yeah, the passive and the main skill are kind of on the weaker end when compared to the other character skills, but the ultimates though, this is the best in the game. This shit right here is stupid good. Aspect of the Crucible Beast is a roaming ultimate, which for 15 seconds has you control this big wolf thingy, and it gets like a whole ass moveset. The light attacks are probably the best for DPS, the heavy attacks and jumping attacks are nice AoEs, you get a roaring projectile attack that goes pretty far, you even get a dodge, every attack does high stance damage, and you have like a boatload of poise and health, which is arguably the best part about it. You can pop this ultimate when you're at low health, and it will just give you all your health back and just double it while you are in this beast form. And it'll end up giving you just as much health as you had when you exited the beast form, obviously in respect to your character's max HP. Now, if you do die in this beast form, you will get knocked down and have to be revived. But one thing that you actually can do if you want to like hide away, if you feel that you're in danger, is just end the ultimate ability early, which actually can save you on some ultimate charge too, because when you use the ult, it puts you at 15% charge and then it starts to drain 1% per second. And you actually can end the ultimate early by either clicking the ultimate button again, or if you use the skill, which this skill is a very long winding up attack, but it does insane damage. Like, this skill alone could have just been the ultimate because it can outdamage things like Guardians and the Raider ultimate ability. Now, being that this skill actually does automatically end the ultimate, you are best saving it towards the end to like maximize your damage. Like, it's not going to be the easiest thing to control by any means, but it's easy enough to be the best in the game. Now, as for the relics and which perks to look out for, there are 3 for the Executor specifically. One of them gives you a small amount of health every single time the weapon like glows gold, which is after 4 deflects, which is like okay at best. You might be able to get like the buff procced a couple times at best in a boss fight, and it will equate to like 10 to 20% of your health back, depending on your level. There is another relic that boosts the damage of your stance, but it does drain your health, kind of like a Chaos Blade from the Dark Souls games. It boosts your damage in the stance by 10%, but it drains 10 HP per hit, which doesn't sound like it's much, but if you deflect 10 times at lower levels, that's like half your health already gone. And 10% damage buff still doesn't make it do more damage than like your normal regular katana that also gets bleed. So if they do end up buffing the skill katana, then this relic could be a lot more useful. But one thing you actually can do is pair this alongside another relic that gives you health back for every single time that you block. And conveniently, it actually is 10 HP per block. So does this completely negate it? So if I were to build around the deflecting, those would be the relics that I do use, alongside some relics that can boost like your guard counter damage. And if you are playing in multiplayer, there are some relics out there that have bosses or enemies be aggroed towards you every single time that you do block. Now, the last Executor specific relic is one that gives you HP for every single time you roar in your ult, which is actually pretty good. I don't really use the projectile much because in most cases I'm really close to the enemy due to like the large health pool that I have. But in those cases where you're fighting like a Night Lord boss that can melt you, it definitely does help. You can like sit at a further distance and just maintain your health. But honestly, the relic perks that I would look out for the most would be the ones that let your starting weapon come with like poison or a bleed skill. Because as I mentioned earlier, a weapon with those infusions is just going to do more status buildup and more damage with the Executor. I recommend poison more so than bleed because it also does give you an arcane skilling. Therefore, it does give you a way to improve that bleed buildup, but just give you poison on top of it, which having more percentage damage in this game is great because enemies have lots of health. There is a boss relic you can get roughly halfway through the game that can boost your damage when you do proc poison, as well as give you a poison infusion. But other than those ones, I would look out for like katana, dexterity, and physical damage boosting buffs, or like HP and stamina boosting buffs. But overall, the Executor is a very powerful character, as his stats and ultimate allow him to output more damage than anyone else, while still being faster and tanky enough to be one of the easier characters to use. I don't think this character has a high skill ceiling by any means. Unless you're stubborn and want to deflect everything in the game, then it can be pretty challenging. But just go ahead and find some dexterity-based weapons like curved swords, katanas, and thrusting swords, hopefully with some status effects, and just go ahead and spam. It'll do perfectly fine in both solo and multiplayer. But that's basically everything I wanted to talk about in this one. I will be making videos like this for the other Nightfarers, so definitely do subscribe for those, and just let me know in the comments which one you would like to see next. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.